All right. So chapter 14 is where we slip into talking about supply and demand again, because we've been sort of avoiding it up until now. We need to get back to it, because those are the meat and potatoes of all economics classes, supply and demand. So we have to get back to it eventually. Now, what's the definition of the word aggregate or aggregate? What does it mean to aggregate if you think of it as a verb? Everyone's got their Google running that they want to Google aggregate for me. Tell me what it is. What does it mean to aggregate? Is it a dance? Is that what it is? Should I be up here dancing about aggregate and talking about demand at the same time?
Yes.
You know I'll start doing it if you say yes. What does aggregate mean? What do you think it means? What's your best guess? What's your guess? What does it mean to aggregate? Well, what does macro mean? Big world, right? So if you aggregate the macro,
Maybe smaller.
Bigger.
it's more along the lines of describing it, right? So if you wanted to describe everything, what might you do with it?
Combine it.
Combine it all. So aggregate is combining everything or adding everything together. Aggregating is basically the sum of, right? So aggregate demand, if you think of aggregate as being a sum or a total, aggregate demand which I will abbreviate as AD from now on so that you guys can separate it from normal demand, right? When I just use demand, I'm talking about the demand for one product, right? Aggregate demand, I'm talking about the demand for everything added up, right? I'm aggregating all of my demand, right? So it's the sum of the demand for Coke, it's the sum of the demand and oil and gas and clothes and food and water and clean air and everything that you potentially might buy. That's what aggregate demand is, right? The sum of all the demand for all products or goods and services. Well, how is that? Well, let's just try an example. So, let's suppose I was just looking at, fine, let's just do Coke. And I mean this as in Coca-Cola. What does the demand for Coke look like? Just the product. This is a review from the first half of this class. If I asked you to draw a demand curve, what would it look like?
Down sloping here.
And what would be over here?
Price.
Prices. What would be down here?
Demand.
Quantity. Okay. And here's our demand. Well, there's the demand for Coke. Now, let's see. We got to add the demand for gas. What does the demand for gas look like?
Same thing.
Same thing. Except it might be a little bit steeper, right? Maybe, right? Because probably demand for gas is a little bit more inelastic. And inelastic demand has a steeper slope, while stuff with elastic demand, which has substitutes, a little bit flatter. Good review. Though, in the end, it's just, if I drew some more demand curves, what would they look like?
Pretty much the same.
Same thing. What happens when I add all those things up?
They look pretty much the same.
Still looks pretty much the same. That's the nice part about demand, right? There's nothing wrong with it looking the same. In fact, you should be kind of happy that it looks the same, because if it looked different, oh boy, this whole class would change. The nice part about it, it's not. And so all that stuff that you learned from the first half of the class carries right on over. Which is good, because I won't have to beat you quite as hard with this stuff as I did back then, because you've already been beaten once, so the bruises are still there, and you'll feel the pain right away. That's all you really need is the pain, right? Okay, well maybe it won't be as painful this time. Alright, so we've sort of accepted that aggregate demand is going to look like this. Alright, now, what are on the axes though? What's over here?
Price.
Prices. Well, how did you guys define prices for all goods and services?
GDP.
GDP drives prices? That's how you describe prices?
CPI.
CPI, right? Inflation is what you want to say, right? Inflation is describing to us what's happening to the prices of all goods. So we put up here, instead of prices, we put the aggregate description of prices, and that's CPI. Now, the other one is GDP, right? Because this is the quantity of all goods and services produced in a given year in a given country, right? That's the frickin' definition of GDP. Please note that this will always be in real GDP, not nominal GDP. Okay, so it will always be normalized with inflation inside of it already taken care of. Just remember that you have to do that kind of stuff, okay? So when we're trying to compare real GDPs, we've already factored out the inflation based on our CPI up here, all right? Now, you may, if you are the querying type, say, Marshall, you know, when I add these two aggregate demand lines, I agree that I'm probably going to get a line that's very similar to a good old demand line. But when I do this an almost infinite number of times, you may say, wait a second, Marshall, I don't really trust you. I know Kiana will do it. She doesn't trust me. So, I will give to you a little bit of an extra explanation for why aggregate demand still looks like a good old regular demand curve, okay? Should that be an A or an E? It should be an A, right? Yep. Okay, so one of the reasons that it should look like this is the real balances effect. In other words, how much GDP is generated by someone with a fixed income. So imagine, you will, you're, 60 to 65 years old and you have retired. Or I guess I should say 60 to 67 years old, because that's the official retirement age now, or 67. When you retire, what happens to your income is that the government says, okay, you have retired, or your pension plan, whichever one you get, right? They say, look, as soon as you're retired, blam, this is going to be your salary from now on until the day you die. Here it is, $60,000. That's all you're ever going to get, right? If you have exactly $60,000 to spend, when you spend money, if CPI is, say, right here at 110, let's suppose 100 is down here, and GDP, real GDP, let's go with, say, $15 trillion worth of GDP. So I'm going to try this half of the class to put numbers on all of my graphs now, so that you guys have a numeric basis for everything that we're doing. Because last semester, or last half of the semester, you guys kind of complained about that a little bit, or didn't get it as well as I wanted you to do, so I'm going to try putting numbers on here to see if it makes a difference, right? So, if prices go up, let's suppose that CPI goes up to 115. What happens to the value of my $60,000 salary? That doesn't change.
It's not worth as much.
it's not worth as much, right? So when I go and spend my $60,000 on GDP, how much real GDP am I generating from that $60,000 of spent money? Less, right? So in other words, when CPI goes up, real GDP will go down. And it's simply because the value of our goods and services has been inflated by those prices, and it's not real, right? If you have a fixed income, when prices rise, your money will not generate as much GDP. It just can't. A bus ride used to cost you $1.20, now it costs you $1.40. If you want to take the bus to the store so that you can buy your groceries, you're going to have less money to do it, right? Because once you turn 67 years old, you're too old to drive. Get the hell off the road.
At least you should.
Yeah, I know, my mom's driving around up on those roads and it just makes me scared to death. Try to avoid driving in my own hometown whenever my mom is gone. Anyways, so the fact, this is one of those effects. Now, another one of those is an export effect. Remember that part of GDP is X minus M, right? Part of GDP is X minus M. If prices of U.S. goods are rising because our inflation is going up, that means prices of American goods are rising. What do foreigners do?
Foreigners will probably buy less.
They buy less. They export less. As our prices, let's be more specific, as U.S. prices rise, foreigners, those bloody bastards, buy less. And think of this as exports fall for us. In addition, if the prices of U.S. goods are going up, what do Americans do? Yeah, we look over at the imports and we say, oh, if I go over to Germany and buy cheese, it only costs me $1 a pound. Whereas if I buy cheese here in the U.S., it's $1.50 a pound. Now, if you can get a big, huge globule of cheese shipped to you and make it worthwhile to ship and still have it be cheaper, what are you going to do?
You're going to ship it.
You're going to ship it, right? Because those Germans make just as good a cheese as the Wisconsin people do, because let's face it, they're the same thing. Except the cows are half from Wisconsin.
I thought they were half.
Oh, that's because they think cows like sun. That's the biggest pile of crap ever. And U.S. will import more. Imports rise. And so what happens to X minus M? X is going to fall, but M is going to rise. But remember what's the sign in front of imports?
Minus.
Negative. Right, so as that number goes up, GDP falls. As this number falls, GDP falls even freaking more. Obviously, as prices go up, GDP falls. Right? And the last interesting one is the real interest effect. It's sort of the third rationale for why GDP is this downward sloping one. This one's a little bit more convoluted, but basically what it means is that higher interest or higher inflation leads to higher interest. Remember that we care about that real interest rate. Banks care about real interest rates. They will never have a negative real interest rate. So when inflation goes up, In order to guarantee that the real interest rate is positive, bankers have to keep raising the nominal interest rates to keep it positive. And as interest rates get higher, what do businesses do? Borrow less, right, exactly. And businesses borrow less. And why does that throw GDP down? Actually,
I don't know that.
what's the formula for GDP?
C plus I plus G.
So if businesses are borrowing less, what's falling? I, right? Business investment falls. So the I portion of GDP is falling. So this one is basically saying the consumer portion falls. This one basically says that the net exports, X minus M, falls. And this one says that business investment falls when prices go up. So by default, if prices go up, what happens to GDP?
Goes down.
It's gonna go down. And in order for that to happen, you've got to have a line that looks like that. An inverse relationship so that when one goes up, the other goes down. Likewise, when prices fall, what happens to GDP?
Goes up.
Goes up, right? Because if prices actually decline, your money is now able to buy more, you will buy more, and GDP will grow. So these are all, so again, C, X minus M, and I. What's the only component missing here?
Government.
Government, right? The one thing that you have to hand to the government is that they don't really give a crap about prices, right? Because if a toilet seat costs $2,000, what does the government do?
Spend $2,000.
They buy a toilet seat for $2,000, and it won't bother them one lick. Because all of that $2,000 right into GDP. It's why they don't care, folks. It's why the government doesn't really care about what prices are. There is no government effect in GDP, right? Government just basically says, if I need to spend it, I will. I don't care where. Good or bad, I don't know. It just is. All right, so the fact remains, though, is that we have a curve for aggregate demand, and it's good old aggregate demand. It's the same as demand at the market level. It's just the sum of everything. And again, remember that it represents everything, okay? One of the sort of the more difficult problems is taking the generality of this and not looking at it as one thing, right? This is the sum of everything. So don't think of it as just clothes, or just gas, or just electricity, or it's everything. Which again is from there's one line that describes it per picture. Mind blowing, okay? Alright, so if CPI rises, so if prices rise, you will not, and I repeat, you will not tell me that aggregate demand falls. Just like back in chapter 3, when price rose for a specific good, you did not tell me that the demand for that product fell. You told me that the quantity demanded would fall. Okay? That same concept still applies here. Okay? Aggregate demand is the relationship between GDP and CPI. If either CPI or GDP change, nothing happened to aggregate demand. Nothing. All we did is move from one point on the line to a different point on the line, right? When CPI is 110, GDP is 15 trillion. When CPI is 115, GDP is 14 trillion. Demand, aggregate demand, did not change, okay? Just like it did back in chapter 3 when we were talking about the demand for Coke or corn or vegetables or pizza or whatever it is that we were talking about. All right? So if CPI rises, real GDP falls, and aggregate demand stays the same, i.e. a change in put space there so it looks like it's a different word, a change in the quantity aggregately demanded. Aggregately demanded. I'm not sure aggregately is a real word, but demanded is acting as a participle there, and so therefore it's an adjective, and I need an adverb to describe an adjective. English 101 for you guys.
I thought this was economics.
But you have to do as much English in economics as you do anywhere else. So you want to use good English as much as you can, dude. Right? All right. So because of this, then, what does change, i.e. move, aggregate demand? Well, what moved demand back in chapter 3 and chapter 4? All right. So your first response is, wait a second, Marshall, I know this one. So all I need to know is what are my non-price determinants of AD? And you are absolutely correct. Now the question is, what are those? Well, it used to be that I would give you a table for it, and you could write it down and or memorize it. This one, though, this time, unlike I did back in the first half, you're going to have to know this one without me giving it to you. Because it turns out that it's not that hard. So, one of the non-price determinants that we worry about is consumer spending. So if consumers spend more, guess what happens to aggregate demand?
Goes up.
Goes up, right? Because if we're buying more stuff, what's happening? More stuff is being made, real GDP is on the rise. The second non-price determinant of aggregate demand is business investment. In other words, if businesses are investing in more capital, what's going to happen to real GDP? It's going to go up, right? Because if businesses are building more factories, what's the plan right after the factories get built?
Make stuff.
More stuff, hire more stuff, more work, more production, more GDP. Excellent. You see the pattern yet?
Yeah, government spending.
Hey, wait a second. How'd you know the next one was government spending?
Because this is just the formula for GDP.
Exactly. It turns out that the 5 non-price determinants of aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The first one is consumer spending. The second one is business investment. The third one is government spending. What's the fourth one?
Exports.
Exports. What's the fifth one?
Imports.
Imports. Exactly. These are the 5 things that when you hear something about the macroeconomy will tell you what's happening to aggregate demand. Now, why did I put a star next to imports?
Does imports go up, GDP goes down.
Yeah, this is the one spot that has an inverse relationship. Because what's the sign in front of the imports? Minus. So if we have more imports, we have less GDP. Do not be tricked into that one. I'm almost guaranteeing you that there will be at least one question either on the quiz or on the final, that'll ask you about imports and what happens to aggregate demand. Alright? So know how to handle the inverse relationship. All the other ones, though, they're exactly what you think, right? If we have more exports, we have more GDP. If we have more government spending, we have more GDP. If we have more business investment, etc., etc. Okay? All the other ones have a nice, good old, regular, direct relationship. Alright, so. So what this means, then, is that you should be able to play a similar game here as we did back in our Chapter 3 days. Now note, please, that we're only talking about aggregate demand right now. What have I not gotten to yet?
Supply.
Aggregate supply. So bear with me as I focus on the aggregate demand side for a little bit, just to be safe. Okay. So. What happens to aggregate demand if? Let's see. You read that consumer confidence has fallen. Here.
80's gonna fall.
Why?
Because if your consumer confidence is falling, you're not gonna spend as much, so consumer spending is gonna go down. So
Exactly, right? So, AD will fall due to falling C. So basically, you're always going to tell me what happens to aggregate demand based on which piece of aggregate demand is changing, all right? And it's your job to be able to interpret what that sentence is in terms of C, I, G, X, and M, okay? And hopefully, it will be relatively straightforward, right? If I tell you consumer confidence, I mean, it's not a long leap to consumer spending, okay? Let's suppose you hear government is decreasing spending to balance the budget.
80's.
And again, which way does AD shift when it falls or rises?
Left.
Left when it falls,
right,
right when it rises. So here you would say the same thing. AD will fall due to less G. Alright, so let's try another one. You read that imports are falling due to foreign wars.
I think what's gonna rise?
AD is going to rise. Why?
Because imports have a.
Yes. AD will rise in this instance because this is the one, imports. It's got the inverse relationship, so when imports go down, our GDP actually goes up. One more, just to be safe. You read that CPI has fallen from 108 to 105.
No change in aggregate demand.
Good. Why?
Because that's a price
It's not a non-price determinant.
Right. So 80 stays the same. What does change?
real
Quantity aggregately demanded.
Real GDP will just rise, right? Because there's an inverse relationship between prices and GDP, real GDP, or quantity aggregately demanded, which is the fancy way of saying GDP. All right. Okay, so aggregate demand, hopefully, not too bad, okay? The nice part about it is that it's very similar to the demand that we were working with before, and even this sort of keeps things in a relatively contained box because we know the formula for GDP already, right? We've already gotten in our head C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which is of course why you have seen that question on a quiz already, because it's more important than just being able to utilize it. You have to be able to apply it again here coming along, right? So that's why I've continually asked you, what is the formula for GDP? Because it's important that you remember its components. All right, so, oh boy. Aggregate supply, folks, is not the same. So I'm going to warn you right off the bat that it is a little bit on the different side. You can't expect everything to carry over straight along, and unfortunately, this is where we diverge a little bit from our prior explanations of supply. All right, now, the reason why we have different types of aggregate supply curves, though, is because of Robert Maynard Keynes. Hopefully, some of you have heard of the phrase Keynesian economics before. First of all, let me... The phonetic spelling is Keynes. It looks like it's Keynes, and everybody who reads it thinks it's Keynes, but this is British. He's a Brit, and so they of course said Keynes. Don't ask me why. I'm not a historian. I don't know anything about, history of names and name calling, but for whatever reason, this guy's name is Keynes. It looks like you could, think of him as a Miami guy, right? He's a Kane, right? But so when you talk to someone else about economics and they say Keynes, realize that's what they're saying. They mean to be saying Keynes. They just see the word key, and it's really hard not to say Keynes. Okay, so Keynes, right? And his Robert Maynard. Maynard, that's a great name. If any of you guys are going to have kids later on, Maynard. Great name if you want to have a total dork for a kid. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to prejudge names necessarily, but Maynard, folks, that kid is going to be rich beyond his wildest dreams and not be able to share it with anybody. That's a lot of the way Robert Maynard Keynes was too. He went to Cambridge. He was very, very intelligent, but he was also a bit of an ass. Thought he knew everything, and pretty much let everybody know that he knew everything on a regular basis. I honestly believe it's because his mom named him Maynard. Whatever. Anyways, alright, so Keynesian economics. So, Keynesian economics states that demand will create its own supply. That is the catchphrase that drives Keynesian economics. Basically what it says is that if people want it, someone will build it. Right? Which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? So if people want things, people will invent it. Now, just because people invent it, will it mean that you guys will buy it?
No.
Maybe. But yeah, no is unfortunately mostly the right answer. But his theory stems from research on the Great Depression. So Keynes, in his infinite wisdom, was born in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I honestly can't remember which one. But he was a classical economist before he became a Keynesian economist. And what he discovered was that all of the rules of economics prior to the Great Depression were really simple. And we'll explain those in a second. But what happened is that in the Great Depression, all of those rules failed. And Maynard was looking at the economy going, what the bleep just happened? Right? Why is the economy not correcting itself? Prior to the 1930s, the economy, whenever it ran into a recession, there was recessions, right? There was nothing, prior to 1930, there were recessions. But they never lasted very long. He tried to figure out why. And then why in the 30s did all of a sudden, when we had this great quote-unquote depression, why did it continue to last so long?
People were freaking out.
People were freaking out. Why was it that when demand fell, normally when demand falls for a product, what happens to that product? Think about it in terms of just economics, folks, right? So think,
They'll start supplying less.
so quantity will fall. What else happens to? What's the other side of quantity? Price. So if you demand less, the quantity will fall, and what happens to price? Price would also fall. In the 30s, when the Great Depression started, people started buying less goods, but for whatever reason, prices did not fall. Prior to that point in history, prior to the 1930s, whenever demand fell, prices would fall almost immediately afterwards. Why? Again, you're on the right track, right? If people aren't buying things, what happens in the store?
There's a surplus.
There's a surplus. And prior to the 30s, when you had a surplus of things, what did you need to do pretty quickly?
Put it on sale.
You needed to get rid of it pretty quickly, right? Did you have big, humongous warehouses that stored thousands of units of goods in one big box that you could go get easily with a truck? No, because in the 1920s and the 1800s, if you wanted to get your goods, what did you have to do? Folks, you got on a frickin' horse, and you rode it with a cart, and you put the crap in a cart and then rode the horse back. If your supply was available to you up in Minneapolis, which is where Walmart's big supply chain is for this area, how long would it take you to get goods from Minneapolis to Madison with a horse and buggy?
Probably a couple days.
Horses don't go that far, folks. Even if you've got them 6 in a row. Problem is you have to keep feeding them, and then you have to deal with other things. Right? So the problem with it was that we had this very, very, very slow supply chain. But what happened in the 30s? We got cars and trucks. All of a sudden, in order to deal with extra inventory, what would businesses do? Instead of having to sell it, what did they do?
Keep it.
Store it. Put it in storage. And as soon as they need it, they just say, "Oh, I'll just take the truck over." Yeah, it's a one-day drive back in the 30s to get from Minneapolis to Madison. I mean, cars didn't go very fast back then. And
Then again, it's only one day.
yeah, it's only one day as opposed to 1 week. And so what businesses were discovering is that when there was a lack of demand, instead of having to lower their prices to sell their goods, they could just wait. And the other thing about it is what kinds of goods were they making, right? I mean, prior to the 1930s, when you guys were hungry, you had to go to the farmer's market and buy fresh food and eat it that week. What started happening in the 30s?
Refrigeration.
Refrigeration, canned goods, pressurized goods, plastics were invented. All these ways to store things a longer period of time. We were learning more about agronomy so that we knew how long we could handle corn stuffs in order to make them last longer, right? We knew how to keep bugs out of the flour. What happened? Again, when demand fell, instead of lowering prices, we just said, whoa, wait a second, we don't got to worry about it. All right? And so Keynes said, wait, the big thing that used to make the economy fix itself when demand fell was that prices fell. And he said, wait a second, that's not going to happen. So normally when we draw an aggregate supply curve, now don't draw this in your notes yet, normally we would draw aggregate supply like that because it's a good old supply curve. But Keynes said, no. When the economy is in the tank, prices are a lot stickier than we thought they were. So instead, he said aggregate supply looks more like a flat curve because as we went from GDP of, this is CPI was sitting at around 100. And here's GDP, again, real GDP. When GDP was sitting here at, say, let's go with back in the 30s, probably $1 trillion worth of goods. Probably, not even trillion, let's call it billion. We were not very productive as a country back in the 30s. Makes sense, right? So what happened is that when aggregate demand, so here's where aggregate demand used to be. We were always sitting at equilibrium. The whole equilibrium thing, that's all holding true. When here was where aggregate demand was. When aggregate demand fell, normally economists would say, oh, prices would fall and we would get back to a new higher GDP. Not anymore. When aggregate demand fell here, what Keynes discovered was that all that happened is that real GDP just fell. There was no subsequent change in prices. And he's like, what the? How did that happen? And again, it was because of all of the inventions that we discovered that allowed businesses to store goods and services. And the problem with it, the minor problem with it, was what was happening to consumers. Could consumers store their goods and services for a long period of time? Not really, no. I mean, refrigeration started in businesses, right? They learned how to freeze beef and hang on to it for a long period of time. But when we bought a side of beef, what did we have to do?
We had to use it.
We had to use it. Thought as quickly as we could. We maybe had an ice box, but we didn't have electricity to actually keep it cold. Tough luck. And so businesses had this huge advantage. Consumers didn't, and consumers suffered. So Keynes came up with this great idea that, it used to be that falling demand would run into lower prices and then demand would start to shift back up a little bit, or at least GDP would start to shift back up. What Keynes stated was, in order for us to get out of these recessions, something has to push aggregate demand along, right? So if we're sitting here, here's aggregate demand and here's aggregate supply, in order to get GDP to grow, we need aggregate demand to shift to the right. We need it to grow on its own. And what do we have to do to make that happen? Well, what are the 5 non-price determinants of aggregate demand? CIG. Okay. How can we push consumer spending? Think Great Depression, folks. Could we advertise to the people who didn't have a job? I mean, we could, but would it do us any good? No. So to push consumer spending back in the Great Depression, it wasn't possible. All right. Business investment. Could we push business investment?
Yeah.
We could try. We could give them tax breaks. And in fact, some businesses tried to give them tax breaks. But what did the businesses look at aggregate demand and say? Did they need to produce more goods? No. Well, the demand wasn't there to buy them, and they created a whole bunch prior. That's what the Roaring '20s was all about, right? The production of goods, and they were storing it all over the place. They had lots of surplus. Did they need to make anything more? No. So when the government gave them tax breaks to produce more, all they did was pocket the money anyways. So could we make foreigners buy more goods from us? Could we increase exports? No, the rest of the world was going through a depression too. They couldn't buy anything. And again, transport across the ocean. Yeah, no. Could we reduce our own imports? I mean, of course, whose imports would we have to reduce? I mean, the poor people, were they buying any imports?
No.
No. And can the government control rich people?
No.
Not even a little bit, folks. We like to think they can, but that's bullshit.
Kind of the other way.
So we couldn't reduce imports. So what's the last piece of that GDP puzzle? Government spending. And so what Keynes said was that in order for us to get out of this recession, to get GDP to be growing again, we need to push aggregate demand. So the government needs to spend more money. Unfortunately, Herbert Hoover, back in the Great Depression, in his infinite wisdom, what did he do during the Great Depression?
Cut.
Worse than that. Government was collecting less money because people were working less, businesses were producing less, so there were less taxes coming in. The government was getting less money. So what did the government do so it could get more money? Raise taxes. In a depression, the government raised taxes. There was a 12% tax increase on your income during the Great Depression. Because he was using the old rules of thumb that used to play, right? When prices fell, people would start buying stuff again, and then expenses would go back up, and the government would collect on all of its income taxes that it needed to later on, right? So he was just prepping for what the way economics had always worked prior to this. Unfortunately, what happened after he raised income taxes on people?
He made it worse.
He made it worse. So guess what he did the next year?
Did it again.
Yep. 2 years running, Herbert Hoover raised income taxes during the Great Depression. It was classic, right? But again, realize what he was working with. All of his economists were saying they didn't believe this Keynes guy, right? They thought he was a nut job and a bit of an ass, and the ass part was right. But he was also smart, and he pointed out to them, look, this is what is happening. You are not looking at the science correctly. All right? And so Keynes said that we need to push aggregate demand, and once we push aggregate demand enough, in other words, if the government spends money, if the government starts all of these work project programs, people will all of a sudden have a job. Once people have a job, what will they start doing?
Buying stuff.
Spending. Once they start spending, what will businesses do? Start producing more. Once businesses have to produce more, they will start hiring people, and once the flow, the circular flow, is going again, then the government can pull off on the accelerator, quit its spending, and just let the businesses take over. That was the Keynes approach, and of course once Herbert Hoover was released from his presidency, that's what the next president came along, Woodrow Wilson, who said, hey guys, let's start the Tennessee Valley Authority, let's start all of these works project programs, first 101 days of light, folks, that's where Bush got it from, to try and drive people to work. It was just getting us out of the Great Depression talk. Very same stuff, all right? And so once G pushes aggregate demand and the circular flow takes over, everything rolls around again. All right, so that is what a Keynesian economists started to come into play, and their recommendations were, let's manipulate government spending to move aggregate demand back and forth to keep us growing in GDP, right? So if consumer spending drops off a bit, we'll just push government spending a little bit so that the consumer spending rolls back around. Once we see consumer spending go up, then the government says, whoops, slide back a little bit, cut down on some of our spending because the consumers are doing it for us so that we have this nice growth in the economy. Worked like a charm for a good 50 or 60 years. Lots of people think it still might work. Okay, regardless though, that's one side of the coin. Alright, so let's look at it from the other side. So prior to our good buddy Maynard, is it John Maynard Keynes or is it Robert Maynard Keynes? Is it John? Okay. Scratch the Robert out. It's John. Okay, so classical economists. Prior to the Great Depression, this is the way all economics used to work. Standard economic theory. Economic theory prior to the Great Depression. What classical economists said was classical economists stated that the economy is basically always at full employment. That was their assumption. So, according to classical economists, again, CPI and real GDP, we were always at full employment. In other words, we were always producing as much GDP as we could, always. So if in, say, the 30s, GDP was around $1 billion, no matter what the price level was, it was a classical economist's belief that GDP was going to be $1 billion. Period. That's just the way they thought. Alright? So if GDP is $1 billion when CPI is 100, here's our point. If CPI went up to 105, it was their contention that GDP didn't really fall. Alright? The only reason that GDP was at that level to begin with is because prices were skewed, and so they would readjust back to that level again. GDP was the same. So what does aggregate supply look like according to a classical economist?
Straight.
Yeah. Notice the difference between the two types of aggregate supply curves. They're as different as they possibly could be. All right, and of course, this is why all of the classical economists, when they talked to Maynard Keynes, was like, hello? Get off the crack pipe, dude. Right? There is no way that aggregate supply is going to flip itself entirely onto its side. That's just silly. And this is the way it had been, again, for centuries, right? Essentially since economics was born. Think Adam Smith time period, very basically the end of the Dark Ages, right? This is the way economics has been. So what classical economists stated was, if, in this example, remember when aggregate demand fell by a certain amount, our GDP would literally fall by that same amount as aggregate demand. According to classical economists, if aggregate demand fell, prices would be too high. So what would all businesses have to do?
Lower the prices.
They had to lower their prices. Remember, this is pre-1930, so there was no refrigeration, there was no easy transportation. In order for businesses to stay afloat, anytime they got goods, they had to sell them in a reasonable amount of time. Because if they didn't, they would run out of money, and there weren't a whole lot of banks around there that would give you a huge loan either, folks. If you couldn't pay your loans off, the bank came in and seized your goods, period, right? So they had to lower prices. And so as prices lowered, what happened to GDP? So for a moment, GDP dropped to, say, $750 million. But a month after that demand fell, what did they do to prices? They cut them in half. They said, oh, okay, we have to cut our prices. And what happened to GDP when they cut their prices?
It went up a little bit.
It went back up, right? It went up to, say, 4/5 of $1 billion, 0.8 instead of 0.75. And so what did businesses have to keep doing? They kept lowering prices until their surplus was gone, and basically prices would come back to normal. And so would GDP. So, according to classical economists, you never really needed to worry about employment. And again, think about this in the 1800s, right? If you didn't have a job in the 1800s, what happened to you?
You died.
Yes. you were dead. If you didn't have a job, you didn't have enough money to buy food, you died. It was very Darwinian. Right? I mean, there was no social services network back in the 1800s. If you didn't have enough money to survive and your family wouldn't pay for you, tough, right? I hope you can get enough money begging on the street. And if you don't, you die in the street. And so there were a bunch of people that were paid by the government to walk around in the streets and pick up the dead people, right? I mean, that whole skit in Monty Python, Bring Out Your Dead, I mean, that's what it's based off. It's based off of reality in the 1800s, right? Because that's what you had to do. And the reason that they had to do it was that governments didn't have enough money to pay the people to go out and pick up the dead people, so they told people, you have to bring the dead people out to us in the cart. There was an edict that was on the walls that said, this is what you have to do. And hence the skit, Bring Out Your Dead. Which is absolutely hilarious, except that it was based in fact. Morbid, but very Monty Python, if you're into that kind of stuff. So, anyways, this is the way everybody reacted to mini recessions back prior to the Great Depression. They just said, don't worry about it. Businesses will have to lower their prices. You just have to adjust for the reduced spending while that adjustment is going on. Again, that's what governments did back then. When they saw a mini recession start, they would raise taxes because there would be less spending for a while, and then they would make enough money to make it up. And then after the spending came back, they would reduce taxes back to where they were. It was just a little game that the government would play with the shifting of aggregate demand along that aggregate supply curve. So, two diametrically opposed aggregate supply lines. Which one's right?
Yes.
I mean, if businesses reacted this way, such that any time aggregate demand fell, if they lowered their prices, would they sell all of their goods?
Probably.
Yeah. Sure. And if every business did it, and again, what also has to fall with these things? Not just prices, but wages, right? It used to be back in the pre-1930s stage, when a business made less money, so did the workers. Because the amount of money you got paid was directly tied to how much the business collected. Right? If you were working in a grocery store, and you were one of the guys who, transported the goods or, put the stuff in the cart for your customers, the business owner would say at the end of every week or month, this is how much money we have extra. This is how much profit we earned. You get 10%, and he would hand you 10% of the business. He'd take the manager and say, you get 25%, I get the rest as the owner, or whatever they came up with as an agreement. All wages were tied to how much money they earned. So when prices went down, wages went down with it, but the workers didn't care because they were making less, but what were happening to prices? They were going down, so it was okay if prices and wages went hand in hand. Again, if they would just go together, if we would all just quit bitching about the fact that when our wages go down, as long as prices go down, wouldn't that be okay? I mean, theoretically, yeah, right? I mean, what would be wrong with this?
So it's not much worse in theory.
Yeah, unfortunately. Right, the problem started when we started having a separation of salary to profitability in a business, right? Very rarely nowadays do you hear anyone paid based on how much the company made, right? I mean, think about these CEOs that are paid $10 million when the company loses $100 million. How does that even make sense? I don't know, but it happens left and right. Right? Well, because the year before they lost $500 million, and this year they only lost $100 million, he basically earned them $400 million, right? No! The company's still losing money!
Doesn't matter. CEOs get cold too.
Exactly, right. Very true. Especially when they're on a yacht in the middle of, the Atlantic or in the Riviera or whatever. So the question then is, how do we mitigate the two of these together? How do we work with them? Because this sure sounds right to me when we're in a really bad recession or a Great Depression. But once the economy starts humming and we're really close to full employment, I mean, do you want your government spending more money when they don't need to?
No.
So, how do we draw the line? Where do we decide how these two things merge together? Well, that is what's going to bring you back to class on Wednesday so that you can figure out how do these things work together. Because they have to somehow. Because both of these theories, absolutely correct. But it's a mystery until next class.
Or until we look it up.
No, you would look it up. True, you could look it up if you are interested. Anyways, I'm going to leave it here. No homework. Because we didn't finish all of chapter 14. So enjoy.